One night, not too long ago, I told the children about our forthcoming trip to the New York World's Fair. Naturally, they wanted to leave the next day, but I explained that April 22nd was still a long way off. Yet I knew that each of them was tucking away bits and pieces of what they were hearing in those special places in children's minds reserved for promised delights. I told them of the giant globe called the Unisphere, of the little cars that would take them all over the fair, of the place where real helicopters would land, of the Red Umbrella Building, and of the giant tire that was really a Ferris wheel. So off they went, each with a pajama pocket filled with dreams that had to wait until April 22nd.
In 1964 and 65, the greatest metropolis of the 20th century hosted a World's Fair. It was not like the celestial utopia of Chicago's fair in 1893, nor was it even like the celestial world of tomorrow that marked New York 1939. This was New York 1964, the celestial strip mall, sprawling and noisy, a jumble of art, commerce, and entertainment that somehow turned chaos into a charm. And where else could Michelangelo, Walt Disney, and General Motors share the same stage at the same time with Casey Stengel as the sideshow? And where else could a waffle from Belgium provide the principal memory for fairgoers? Only in New York, and only at the 1964 New York World's Fair. The idea for the 1964 New York World's Fair began with Robert Koppel, a man who ran a voice recording booth at the 1939 fair. Koppel had met the world during the 1939 fair and wanted to give his two daughters that chance too. Koppel enlisted the support of New York business and political leaders. On August 10, 1959, Mayor Robert Wagner announced that New York would play host to the world's biggest, most expensive World's Fair ever, a $500 million two-year affair at Flushing Meadow in Queens.
And we invite all of our friends throughout the United States, Canada, from all parts of the world to come and visit this great fair. At that time, we will have open our great new Lincoln Center, which will be the cultural center of the world. Our new arterial highways will make it easier to get to the fair, and once you are at the fair, I know it will be an experience that all Americans and all visitors will be proud of and think of for many years.
The fair organizing committee picked as its president 71-year-old Parks Commissioner Robert Moses, who by the 1950s had already presided over massive physical changes in New York and who had worked on the 1939 fair. During his career, Moses built Jones Beach and other parks, highways, playgrounds, and 100,000 units of public and private housing. Now he would plan and see to conclusion the most elaborate World's Fair ever staged.
Well, physically, it looked not unlike the 1939-1940 fair, only better, bigger, taller buildings, same space.
The late 1950s and early 1960s was a time of unprecedented economic strength in America. Middle-class families moved from the cities into the leafy suburbs, where they could raise their children amid the safety of their lawns and ranch houses. The development of new highways and jet aircraft made going places easy and cheap. The optimism and suburban values radiated by President Dwight D. Eisenhower and the 1960 election of the youthful President John F. Kennedy gave planners an almost surreal vision of a perfect America on which to stage the 1964 New York World's Fair.
When you think of the 1964 World's Fair, you think of the 60s and you think of the youth culture. Well, this was not a fair of the youth culture, and in some ways it wasn't even a fair of the 60s. It was in many ways a fair of the 50s and that post-war economic corporate boom. And so when you talk about some of the displays and you think about issues like ecology, the fair not only didn't present these new ideas, they actually seemed to be totally oblivious to them. It was an old fair at a new time, and it suffered because of it.
The 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadow had assumed mythic proportions by the early 1960s. It was America's last universal bash before the Second World War, and nostalgic feelings for it ran deep in the generation that organized the 1964 fair. The 39 fair featured vivid scenarios of a robust world of tomorrow, a world that would include superhighways and television.
That was exciting. It was really exciting because everything at that fair was the future, the roadways, the cars, the things that we hadn't seen before. And that fair will always impress me.
The 1964 World's Fair would be built on the same site as the one held 25 years earlier. Its design would largely follow the same pattern. And like the Trilon and Perisphere of 39, the 64 fair would have a physical symbol also, the Unisphere. It would reflect the fair's twin themes, man's achievements in an expanding universe and peace through understanding. The fair, however, found neither understanding nor universal peace during the 4 years it took to plan and build it. In 1960, the International Bureau of Expositions, the organization that sanctioned World's Fairs, rejected New York's bid because it would open just 2 years after the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. The Bureau ruled a nation may host only one World's Fair every 10 years. Moses dismissed the action and derided the group as that bunch of clowns in Paris. The fair wasn't even immune to the Cold War. To counter the Soviet Union's planned exhibit in New York, the U.S. government demanded that it be allowed to showcase America at an exhibit of its own in Russia. The outraged Soviets said no and withdrew from the New York fair. Yet, amid the hostility of the Cold War, the fair did land a major attraction, and it went by the simple name of Pitti, or Pietà. Pope John XXIII personally gave his consent in 1962 to temporarily moving Michelangelo's sculpture from St. Peter's Basilica to the Vatican Pavilion at the fair. Meanwhile, several American companies signed Walt Disney to design their exhibits. The stars of my show are Michelangelo and Walt Disney, Robert Moses later remarked.
We want you to come again, Mr. President, in 1964 to open this exposition, to further emphasize your leadership in world affairs and your confidence in peaceful assembly and healthy rivalry among the nations.
On a cold, windy day in December 1962, President John F. Kennedy, who had supported the fair and pushed through $25 million in congressional funding for it, attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the Federal Pavilion. He spoke of the fair's importance in promoting American values and cheerfully accepted an invitation to attend the fair's opening in 1964. Within a year, Kennedy would be murdered in Dallas. Construction of pavilions and exhibits continued at a hurried pace through 1963 and into 1964. It was now promoted as the first billion-dollar fair, thanks to the ability of Robert Moses to wrap highway and Shea Stadium construction costs within the fair's overall budget. In all, 150 pavilions were under construction and a record 66 nations would be represented, despite the international ban. Corporate America prepared major exhibits to showcase products.
It was a lightning rod fair. Here was this big, expansive undertaking being staged by this incredible corporate force that had emerged right after World War II, and then they didn't hold back. These pavilions were multi-million-dollar extravaganzas, and this American post-war dream was on display in just incredible profusion. And at the same time, it's encountering a whole new critical force of younger people with different priorities.
The Unisphere, the centerpiece of the fair, turned out to be its most significant engineering, artistic, and enduring achievement. A seemingly simple stainless steel globe balanced on a pedestal was the most difficult of all things to build for the fair.
The first detailed consideration, of course, was the base. When we view a 2-foot model of the world from the top side, the base is of relatively little importance. But when people view the Unisphere, the base will be the structure immediately in front of them, rising 20 feet above the reflection pool. Aesthetics here are obviously important, and so Peter Muller-Monk created the design for a 70-ton open sculptured base to convey lightness, grace, and simplicity, and yet keep it engineeringly sound to support a 250-ton sphere. The problem wasn't too unlike fastening a beach ball to a golf tee, if you'll permit a slight exaggeration.
Officials promoted the fair tirelessly and enlisted television, the miracle of the 1939 fair, to attract both the urban masses and suburbanites to Flushing Meadow. The city built new subway lines and painted trains in the official fair colors of blue and orange. New highways laced Queens to cater to the easy-on, easy-off suburban lifestyle.
It was a period that saw a lot of marriages, a lot of babies, a lot of families moving to the suburbs, and there was a lot at the fair that catered to the baby boom generation.
As the April 22, 1964 opening date closed in, civil rights groups planned massive protests to disrupt President Lyndon Johnson's speech and to keep crowds away by blocking traffic. Wildcat labor strikes and the deaths of 2 workers in a construction accident, meanwhile, hindered completion of the site.
I remember driving with my dad through the roads. There was tremendous construction going on just before the fair. The roads were a mess. They were building the superhighway at that time, you know, the overpasses of the Van Wyck Expressway. And I remember driving along the Grand Central Parkway and watching the tractors just tear up all the grass and everything that was there, and thinking, my God, what are they doing here, you know?
So fret not, parents, or tear your hair, and wonder why Johnny's so long at the fair. And Johnny, do not fume and foam if your parents are late in getting home. Nobody departs until it closes from the promised land of Mr. Moses. The poet Ogden Nash published that verse on the eve of the fair's opening. The 1964 New York World's Fair had been plagued by just about everything but locusts in its planning and construction. And then it rained. With only a handful of demonstrators and an opening day crowd of around 90,000 instead of the anticipated 250,000, the promised land of Mr. Moses opened on April 22, 1964. More protests, bad weather, poor attendance, and financial problems would hound the fair throughout its run. The critics were equally nasty. Time magazine described the fair in a cover story as the world of already, in a pointed comparison with the 1939 fair's World of Tomorrow.
They felt that they came up short in part because of the critical press. I mean, initially, everybody, of course, was behind the fair, every corporation, which is every advertiser, the city, the country. So all the initial press is really puff pieces promoting the fair. But once the commentators got to it, it just became a series of negative articles about the fair. There was a number of really conspicuous examples. There was one in Life magazine that compared the fair to the suburban sprawl of gas stations and fast food places on highways connecting cities, and why go to the fair when you could see it right at home.
New York Mayor Robert Wagner remarked at opening ceremonies that the fair seemed to arrive at the end of one era and the beginning of another. He was right. A fair designed in the 1950s became a cultural and social curiosity by the time it ended in 1965. America and the world had changed. The fair had not.
The mid-60s was so jammed with historical stuff, but for a kid, it probably stuck out in my mind even more when they were building the fair. JFK had gotten killed, and that was a total shock. Walking home from school numb. By the time we got home, the president had actually died. So there was all the civil rights stuff every night on TV. There was the first film clips of Vietnam. You're in 6th grade trying to make head nor tail of this. The 60s was I think, going to even get rockier. The next few years, we're going to get really heavy with Martin Luther King dying, Bobby Kennedy, the riots that swept across the country, and of course, the splitting apart over Vietnam. But when you're in 6th grade, those are kind of on the back burner. They're almost unreal. The World's Fair was real.
The changing times and all that went with it meant little to the 51 million people who flowed through the gates at Flushing Meadow to romp through a 646-acre world of good times. This was a fair for the young. Young people, young countries, and young attitudes.
The 1964 World's Fair was one of the biggest and most memorable fairs. It was touted at the time as the first billion-dollar fair. There was really, as Moses says, something for everyone. There was about 150 really major pavilions and just much more than anybody could see. A lot of people, especially from the New York area, went 30, 40, even 50 times and more. There was so much to say.
I went probably hundreds of times. You know, I went with my parents a lot. My school went. I would go with my friends, my family. It was just something that I did. It was like, you don't go to the movies, you go to the World's Fair.
I think we attended somewhere in the 70s. We used to keep a record amongst my friends, actually, of how many times we went. It was pretty much an every weekend kind of thing, and once in a while when you could sneak off during the week from school. But certainly there was very few weekends that went by that we didn't show up at least one of the days.
In 6th grade, I was secretly and wildly in love with my teacher, Mrs. Pagano. She'd done all these amazing things, and she drove a 57 Cadillac with big fins, purple. I wouldn't say she was eccentric, but she was quite a character. At the end of the school year, she asked, please raise your hand if you think your parents will never take you to the World's Fair. So I put my hand up, and so did 3 other boys in the room. She said, I'll see you after class. Went up to her desk afterwards, and much to my amazement, she said, I'm going to take you to the World's Fair. Pinch me. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I'm in love with this woman. It's the end of the school year, and she said we'd sleep over her house, and before I knew it, we were getting ready to go to the World's Fair. The next morning, we piled into that big old purple Cadillac and screamed down towards Flushing Meadows. Radio blasting, and she smoked cigarettes, windows down, and it was astounding.
12-year-old Dominic Tucci of Port Washington, New York, ran away from home, sneaked into the fair, and lived there for 9 days in May 1964. He slept in various pavilions and bought food with coins retrieved from fountains. When asked how he managed to stay there undetected so long, Dominic said, "It's the cinchiest fair to get into." And he wasn't the only one who breached the fair's gates.
This will probably ruin my chances of running for the presidency, but several times we did actually find a convenient fence to go over to get into the fair. And I do remember, because of the kinds of fences that they had, which were kind of modified barbed wire at the top, I do remember as 3 or 4 of us got over, and the last one, who was Tootie Wills, we used to call him Clunky, used to, because he used to be a mishap wherever he went, tried to go over the fence and tore his pants as someone was finding out that we were actually sneaking over the fence. So we just ditched him and ran as fast as we could and left poor Tootie with half of his pants torn apart and enjoyed the rest of the day. Old Tootie Wills went the other way and didn't have any money. That's why we were sneaking in, so he couldn't get in that day. And we met up with him that night and laughed about the whole thing.
Officials worried that the fair's nighttime activities had turned it into a hangout for teenagers. In response, they increased security. The teenagers ignored both the city police and thousands of private Pinkerton guards. "We're looking for girls," said one teenager at the time.
I remember saving my money from a newspaper route, and I saved it for like a month. And that day, when I picked her up, I had like 20 bucks in my pocket. And I was so rich that day, it was unbelievable, you know? And there I am, I'm the big guy, I got the 20 bucks in my pocket, and I didn't even make a ride or bike to the bus. We walked to the bus, and we spent the whole day at the fair, and I got my first kiss, I remember, in the Coca-Cola pavilion, waiting online to get in. You know, it's one of those things that I just like clearly remember from the fair.
The fair built special attractions for children, with a particular focus on presenting science in an entertaining way. The Adamsville, USA exhibit banned parents. Unattended children experimented with mechanical arms and collected an irradiated dime as a souvenir from the Atomic Energy Commission.
It was an exhibit where you gave them a dime, they ran it through some uranium-type isotopes, and they gave you a disc, a blue disc, as a souvenir charm. And believe it or not, I've kept one of these irradiated dimes in my pocket for the last 32 years.
Children were everywhere at the fair, on the backs of parents, in little cars, and in the arms of gentle police officers who made sure that no child was lost for long. Even children who inadvertently escaped from their parents found a fun refuge at the fair. Even with entertainment as the focus of many serious exhibits, Robert Moses refused to build the great midway of amusements that had become the top attraction of past World's Fairs. "We have chosen the side of angels," Moses quipped. Not even puppets were immune from Moses's wrath against anything even slightly provocative.
The '64 fair was so clean that controversy developed about a couple of topless puppets that apparently caused some controversy.
For the newly independent countries of Africa, the fair offered the chance to exhibit their unique cultures separate from a colonial power. Asian and Latin American nations, too, made sure that they would strut their best stuff on the world stage. Japan fronted its pavilion with a traditional tea ceremony set, but the country was more interested in marketing its new electronic products, high standards of quality control, and small cars.
Seeing these people from all over the world there and all the different cultures and stuff, and I remember, come from a hardcore group of New Yorkers and feeling like so proud that here we are having this in New York and seeing all these people right there, from all these different countries and feeling like, oh, this is like really cool.
I think for kids it was neat. You got to see different presentations. I mean, we've gotten so multicultural in this country now, and people think nothing about going out and having sushi or Mexican food. Back in the '60s, there wasn't quite that variety.
I used to sit around the edge of the Unisphere and just kind of watch all the people go by and look at all the different people. There's people there from all over the world. Even being in New York, being in Glendale was not like living in Manhattan. You didn't get the wide variety of international folk that you got in Manhattan. So I used to love just sitting there and watch all the people go by and the tourists and listen to all the different languages of people going by. I can remember sitting there sometimes for an hour or more just watching people going by.
Space, too, figured prominently at the fair. NASA built a space park and showcased rockets and the Mercury spacecraft. Meanwhile, the corporate powerhouses of America built lavish exhibits in an unrivaled flexing of marketing muscle. The people loved it. Travelers Insurance mounted an elaborate exhibit devoted to the triumph of man. Sinclair featured dinosaur models that moved. IBM promoted its new Selectric typewriter on one hand while showcasing the promise of computers with the other. The Bell Systems exhibit focused on the history of telecommunications and on its new touch-tone phones.
We had the push-button phone. I remember that.
Yeah.
I'd never seen a push-button phone before. And when we were waiting for the tram to take us back to our hotel, they had 3 or 4 phone booths, and they all had push-button phones in them. And I thought it was a toy phone because real phones couldn't have buttons on them. And I went over and I was just playing on the phone. That was probably one of the most fun things that I had to do because I could play with it rather than just sit there and watch it. And now, I mean, nobody's ever heard of rotary phones.
Video phones, too, were displayed and promoted as something that everyone would have by 1970.
We talk, and that was the first time we were able to use a telephone without using a handheld, receiver and transmitter on it. You can just sit there in the booth and you can talk just like we are now, and which was really nice. And we called her sister in New Jersey.
Another sister
in New Jersey.
I told her we were on television and we could see what they were doing.
And she believed us.
Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors spent $110 million to build their showcases and lure visitors to the latest models. Ford unveiled the signature car of the mid-1960s, the Mustang.
The Ford Pavilion had different cars. We were 12 and 13 years old and very into cars. That was a big thing then. We would wait online for our favorite car, and even though you might have to wait an hour to get into the pavilion, we'd be willing to wait another half hour to get the right car to drive in, because we wouldn't take anything but a Mustang.
General Motors sought to repeat its 1939 Futurama with Futurama 2.
The GM Futurama exhibit, which of course was modeled on the 1939 Futurama, was the hit of the 1939 fair, and which today everybody always cites as being very insightful and predicting all sorts of developments over the next 50 years. General Motors decided to come back with Futurama 2 and project ahead again.
3/4 of our Earth lies beneath the cold, still deeps of the sea, a water world in which we now can find abundance far beyond our dreams. Now we can farm and harvest a drifting, swimming, never-ending nourishment, food enough to feed 7 times the population of the Earth. In aquacopters, search the ocean floor to find miles deep, vast fields of precious minerals and ores. And in the deepest trenches of the seas, study at first hand long-hidden secrets of survival. Work easily the rich oil deposits of the continental shelves, while trains of submarines transport materials and goods along the waterways of the undersea. And in warmer seas are new realms of pleasure. A weekend, if you wish, at Hotel Atlantis in the Kingdom of the Sea. A holiday of thrills and of adventure, of radiant wonders in the sun-bright gardens of the sea.
A very nice young man called in and wished to make a hotel reservation in the underwater hotel, which was this was demonstrated in the Futurama exhibit.
In some ways, it's personified by their jungle road builder, which was a giant machine that could go foraging through jungles and forests, chopping down trees and leaving a road in its path. Today, these sort of things are very easy targets for a more ecologically minded age. That was a flaw in a lot of the technology that was put forth in '64.
General Electric and Pepsi-Cola, among others, enlisted Walt Disney to populate their exhibits with artificial people or audio animatronic figures to deliver marketing messages. Disney used the fair as a test bed for new technology and attractions for his planned theme park in Florida. Pepsi produced It's a Small World, starring little animatrons singing and dancing songs of peace in a global festival of love.
Maybe because I was a kid, but that was just the best ride. I must have gone on that 6 times, and we got the record, and I would sing along with it, and it got to the point where I could just sing it in every single different language. Those little dolls were so cute, and I loved that ride. I thought that was great.
The companies gave away brochures and trinkets aplenty to promote their products. Tiny Heinz pickles, for one, became a popular though easily misplaced item. Souvenirs could be found in an abundance. Ride the monorail. The box that served as a seat became an instant souvenir. Balloons, T-shirts, model cars, and many other tacky but hardly trendy artifacts became objects of desire among fairgoers. Who wouldn't want to buy a hat with a feather in it to parade around the fairground? Even though fair officials complained about the poor attendance, fairgoers thought the lines were too long for the more popular attractions. But even in the heat of the summer, waiting to see the future or to ride in a Ford Mustang was worth it. Lines did have benefits for a chosen few.
It was in August of '64, and 2 neighbors and I went to the fair, and we ended up in the Clairol exhibit. And coming out of the exhibit, there was a photographer with a camera tripod, and he stopped me and asked me if I would be interested in doing some more pictures if these that he was taking turned out. He said, chances are you'll never hear from me again because we're taking hundreds of pictures. So I proceeded to forget about it and went home, and a couple of months later we got a letter in the mail asking if I would come down to their office on Fifth Avenue and talk to them about a film. Their interest was in hair coloring and loving care product. Cover the Gray, which I had quite a bit of.
Art might have been third on the list of things to see at the fair, but great and interesting works could be found everywhere. But it was Michelangelo's Pietà that buried the competition.
I remember I had this marvelous experience. There was a photographer inside. It was sealed up. You couldn't get in, nobody. And while I was hanging the piece up, this photographer says, "You want to come in and really have a good look at it?" Up to 1960, I had painted. I'd never made any sculpture. Occasional fooling around, but I really wasn't into it. And by now, when he said, "Go in and touch that Michelangelo," it was like touching an icon, you know, more than the greatness of the work itself. And it was a very thrilling experience.
Just outside the fairgrounds at Shea Stadium, Casey Stengel and the amazing New York Mets showcased their brand of art and entertainment. There was no better sideshow to the grand doings in Flushing Meadow.
My mother would give me a couple of bucks. I think the entry fee was $1 at that time. Every now and then when I wanted a Belgian waffle, you know, when those Belgian waffles kind of like were melting in my mouth, I'd pocket the extra buck and I'd take my bike and I'd ride it down on the side of the Grand Central Parkway, and then I'd hop over the fence. And that way I'd have an extra buck for the Belgian waffle in the middle of the day, you know, so I'd pocket the extra buck.
Nations and corporations spent tens of millions of dollars to showcase their products and culture, often going to elaborate extremes to entice fairgoers. But the lasting collective memory of the fair seemed to be based on the simplest of foods, a waffle, a gloriously delicious Belgian waffle.
I don't think anything topped the Belgium exhibit and the Belgian waffles, because I don't think anyone could go a day without going over and eating at least one, or maybe if you could eat two, because they were huge. They were great.
They were so huge at the time that, we'd
the
split
reason
it.
why we could remember, my mother bought them for us.
It was the first time I ever had a Belgian waffle, and my wife said the same thing when she went to the World's Fair. She said it was the first time she had a Belgian waffle. Talk about small town, New England kind of diet.
I have been trying to replicate that taste now for the 30-plus years it's been since I was at the fair. I've tried Belgian waffles in different countries all around the United States, and that is a memory that I've not been able to replicate, that I believe I should be able to, because it seems like such a simple request. But that was an incredible taste. It was exactly $1, I remember it well, and never a day went that we didn't have a Belgian waffle at the fair.
World's Fair opens for its second and final season under sunny skies and a better crowd than marked last year's opening. There are 168 pavilions for visitors to see, many of them enlarged and refurbished after a long winter's sleep. A visitor with the time and money has 646 acres to roam, and such a roam can't be completed in a day.
Fair attendance never came close to the anticipated 70 million in paid admissions. Things got so bad in the spring of 1965 that Robert Moses called on the U.S. Weather Bureau to put a more positive spin on its forecasts. The Weather Bureau at first refused, then complied with the request by focusing on the sunny rather than the cloudy part in its forecasts. As the fair approached the end of its 2 years in Flushing Meadow, however, something changed. People started to come in huge numbers. Daily attendance doubled as the fair's end in October loomed on the calendar.
One of the phenomenal things that happened was that as the fair came to a close, there was just this incredible burst of attendance. I think something like 10 million people attended the fair during that last month or two.
When I was 12 years old, I went to St. Pancras School in Glendale, and I was in the boys' choir. And the closing day of the fair, we sang at the Vatican Pavilion, and that was like the end of the fair, and it was like a really big to-do. And when it was all over, I remember looking around and thinking, wow, this is it. It's all over. 2 years of going to the fair and seeing all this stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, my parents were there, and it was incredibly crowded. And they're like, oh, come on, it's time to go. It's time to go. Let's get out of here. There's too many people. And I just wanted to stay and just look at it one last time. It was really cool. I had a lot of fun there.
On October 16, 1965, Westinghouse buried its time capsule to commemorate the fair. The cylinder included a Beatles record, a bikini, Polaroid camera, electric toothbrush, transistor radio, credit cards, birth control pills, and dozens of other items. Westinghouse announced that it would be open in the year 6939.
As it was getting near the close of the fair, we had heard from the administrator's office that there would be a time capsule, and we were each to put our name in it. And so that was a big thing. That was the last thing that we did as a group, having worked at the fair. And it was a wonderful, happy experience.
On October 17, 1965, the final day of the fair, 450,000 people swept through the gates. It was so crowded that people could barely move. People began to take pieces of the fair, including flowers. At 2 a.m. on October 18, 1965, the fair closed its gates. Almost 52 million attended the fair during its 2-year run.
I was really sad. I really was sad. And years later, I went back. I had a job working at the World's Fair, renting bicycles, and they had concerts there, and I worked there. But I was really sad. It was a big part of my life. And that was it, too. You know, it felt like it was a part of me. And that was one of the neat feelings, you know. I had something to do with it, just being a New Yorker.
Even on the last day and after the last day, when they started taking all the buildings down, it just seemed incredible to me that all of the energy and all of the enjoyment that the people that had been through the fair for those years, they were just taking it all down and making a park out of it. I just wanted them to keep the buildings there and make it into a park that we could go to for like years.
It was such a significant part of our lives for those 2 years. And it was the thing to do. It's what young kids did who lived as close as I did to the fair. I was only a mile away. So it was like going to the park. So it was losing part of our lives when the fair went away. It was very sad for all of us.
In later years, my buddy and I, we used to go bike riding. I would ride from where I lived in Queens, even when I was in my 20s and 30s, and we would bike down Yellowstone Boulevard and do a couple circuits around the lake there and then go through the park itself. And even at that point, I would ride through the streets there, and I could remember where all the pavilions are, even though it was just grass now. You know, I'd say, oh yeah, that's where Bell Telephone was, and that's where the IBM pavilion was, and that's where the GM building was. I used to love just riding around there and reminiscing as I rode around on my bike.
The 1964 New York World's Fair was the last of the 20th century World's Fairs to take place in one of America's great old cities. It was also the last fair organized by people who saw America's big cities as a perfectly natural place to hold a fair. Scholars may debate the '64 fair's merits and place as a point marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. This fair defies such lofty examination. It was really about fun, about being young and free, about sneaking into the joint and scraping together just enough allowance money to buy a Belgian waffle.